sign it. You have taken enough from this family." The legal contract slid across the cold marble table and stopped inches from my plate. Its thick paper edge caught my thumb, stinging like a fresh cut, while the clinking of silver forks abruptly ceased all around the private exhibition room. The heavy scent of melted beeswax candles and my mother-in-law's gardenia perfume suddenly made me nauseous. I looked up at William Sterling. The chairman of Sterling House of Jewels glared down at me. To him, and to the wealthy auction house representative staring at our table, I was just Lauren Davis, a 34-year-old independent gemologist who had married into their world and was now, apparently, ruining their centennial gala. "You are a broke nobody," William said. His voice dropped to that icy register he saved for employees. "Sign away your rights, and we will forget this." Connor stood right next to his father. My husband of 6 years did not yell, nor did he step in to defend me. Instead, he leaned down and placed a heavy silver pen on top of the contract. "Just sign it, Lauren," Connor whispered. His voice carried that gentle, reasonable tone he always used when he wanted me to doubt my own memory. "We can end this tonight. Tomorrow morning, we can talk about this like husband and wife." I stared at the pen. It was the fountain pen he had given me on our wedding day. The exact instrument we used to sign our marriage license was now being offered to sign away my professional integrity. I looked down at the document, scanning the dense paragraphs to pick out the key demands. I was to withdraw my formal objection to the provenance of the sterling blue diamond. I was to confirm, under my professional license, that the company had a clear and undisputed title to the stone. Finally, the contract demanded I hand over all my historical research and take full legal liability if any claims ever arose. "Did you read the final clause?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. Connor shifted his weight. He looked at the crystal chandelier, then at the display case holding the deep blue diamond, focusing on anything except my face. "He understands loyalty," William answered for his son. "Something you never learned." The elite guests were watching me like a jury waiting for a confession. I picked up the silver pen, letting the cold metal warm against my skin for a long moment. I felt the crushing weight of their expectations. Then I set the pen down on the marble. I reached into the inner pocket of my evening coat, pulled out a thin envelope, and slid a single sheet of paper directly over William's contract. It was a notice of title dispute and immediate withdrawal from sale. William's eyes darted across the page. The document listed the original file code from 1968. It carried the name Miriam Hart. Right in the center, highlighted in bold, was a direct quote from the company's own hidden workshop ledger. "Safekeeping only. No transfer of title." A loud crash shattered the quiet. Susan Sterling, my elegant mother-in-law, had dropped her champagne flute. Crystal shattered across the floor. She gripped the edge of her chair, her face drained of all color as she stared at her mother's name on that paper. She looked like she might collapse right there in her designer gown. Thomas Keene, the lead compliance officer for the auction house, stood up from his seat at the end of the table. He cleared his throat. "As of this afternoon, we have received a full evidence package," Thomas announced. His professional tone cut right through the tension. "The sterling blue is officially withdrawn from the centennial sale. The stone cannot be moved until a proper chain of custody is established." William's face turned a mottled red, and he pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is a forger. This is a desperate attempt to extort us." I did not raise my voice to argue. I simply looked at my father-in-law. "That piece of paper does not ask you to believe me. It only requires you to stop selling something that is under dispute." The room broke into chaotic whispers. Museum board members and wealthy collectors started pushing back their chairs, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. Behind William, a massive projector screen still displayed the gala's theme in golden letters. 100 years of integrity. William grabbed Connor's arm and pulled his son close. He spoke in a harsh whisper, clearly thinking the noise of the room would cover his words. "Get the stone out before they lock the vault," William ordered. I heard him. I turned my head toward the reinforced glass display case holding the sterling blue. Just as the head of security unlocked the outer housing to move the diamond into insurer custody, the velvet box inside the case sat in the harsh spotlight. It was completely empty. The sterling blue was gone. A cheap glass replica sat in its place, catching the light like a cruel joke. "Lock the doors," Thomas Keene shouted over the rising panic in the room. Heavy oak doors slammed shut, and the click of the brass deadbolts echoed through the gallery. The elite guests froze. their eyes darting from the empty velvet box to the security team blocking the exits. William turned his fury directly on me. She took it. The chairman pointed a shaking finger at my oversized evening coat. She staged this ridiculous dispute to distract us and stole the family property. I did not wait for security to grab me. Stepping into the center of the room, I slipped off my coat and laid it flat on the marble table, next to the fake glass diamond. I asked the female security director to search the fabric in front of everyone, needing these wealthy guests to see exactly what I carried. The guard went through the pockets with careful precision. Nothing came out except my phone, the paper notice, and a small leather pouch. William sneered when she pulled out my father's old jeweler loupe. "A cheap magnifying glass," he said, making sure the board members heard him. "Fitting." I kept my voice steady, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. My father taught me that a stone does not need to be perfect to tell the truth. It just has to be real. The security director tapped the screen of her tablet, pulling up the electronic system records. The display case was opened exactly 11 minutes before the contract was presented, she announced to the room. I asked whose credential was used to open the electronic lock. The director hesitated, glancing at William before answering. It was Connor Sterling. My husband stepped forward quickly. He claimed he was only checking the exhibition lighting because his father had asked him to ensure everything looked perfect. When Thomas asked to see the camera footage, the security director shook her head. The close camera angle had been blocked for exactly 4 minutes while the catering staff raised the heavy centennial banner. William immediately moved to protect his son. The old man looked at me with pure disgust and suggested I could have easily swiped the badge from my husband's jacket earlier in the evening. But the director pulled up a different video feed. A camera near the service elevator had caught a figure pushing a secure transport case out of the building. The person wore a dark jacket, and their face remained completely hidden from the lens. However, their left hand rested over the handle, clearly showing a heavy gold signet ring. Both William and Connor wore identical family rings. Before Thomas could ask another question, Susan grabbed my wrist and pulled me into the private lounge next to the gallery. Her hands were shaking violently, rattling the heavy gold bracelets on her wrists. "Withdraw the notice, Lauren," she begged, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "Not all truths can save the dead." I stared at her pale face. "Did your mother ever sell that stone?" Susan refused to answer the question directly. She only whispered that her mother wanted her to be safe. The absolute terror in her eyes provided the only answer I needed. She knew exactly what the word safekeeping meant. Back in the main hallway, Connor cornered me against the wall. He used his softest, most reasonable tone, warning me that my investigation was going to destroy hundreds of innocent jobs. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket and offered it to me, calling it an amended agreement. He promised the family would label the missing diamond a simple misunderstanding if I just signed my name. I looked down at the paper. It still required me to verify their false history. But something else caught my attention. A rare spelling error on the word provenance, missing the letter E, sat next to a strange, narrow left margin. The formatting perfectly matched the digital draft Connor had emailed me 2 days before the gala. He had labeled that email attachment as a legal team review. "Who wrote this new version?" I asked. Connor looked me right in the eye. "The legal department drafted it." I did not argue. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the original email he had sent 2 days ago, and forwarded the entire digital file to Thomas Keene for secure preservation. Then I handed the physical paper back to my husband. Later that night, the gala guests had all been sent home, and I stood in the quiet hallway of our penthouse. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was Thomas. The compliance officer had checked the document properties on the digital file I forwarded. The author tag did not say legal team. The creator of the file was Connor Sterling. I looked down the hall at the man I had married. Connor was pouring a drink in the study, looking exhausted and perfectly innocent. He had not just known about the trap. My husband had built it. Staring at the author tag on my phone screen in the quiet penthouse, the truth finally snapped into focus. The betrayal had not started tonight at the gala. The trap had been set 6 months ago, right when William first offered me the Centennial project. The chairman had called me into his office, sliding a massive leather binder across his mahogany desk. He told me the upcoming auction needed a flawless provenance book, and my reputation as an independent gemologist would bring exactly what the family needed. I took the heavy binder, genuinely believing I was finally being accepted as something more than just Connor's wife. The official history of the sterling blue began with a private European acquisition in 1991. However, there was no original bill of sale, just a modern digital scan. Digging deeper into the insurance archives, I found an old appraisal from 1968 for a remarkably similar stone called the Hart Blue. Between that year and 1991, an agonizing gap of over 20 years existed where the diamond simply vanished from all public records. The weights did not perfectly match, but the math pointed directly toward a recut. When I brought the discrepancy to Connor, my husband merely laughed and poured us both coffee. He claimed his grandfather hated paperwork and suggested I just stick to the traditional story. A few weeks later, I sat in Susan's living room, flipping through a dusty family album. One page held a faded photograph of a young Susan standing next to her mother, Miriam. Someone had carefully cut Miriam's neck and chest out of the picture, but the photographer had captured them standing near a mirror, and the reflection clearly showed Miriam wearing a massive blue stone in an antique setting. Before I could look closer, Susan snatched the heavy book right out of my lap. Her gold rings scratched my hand as she slammed the cover shut, insisting the necklace was nothing but cheap costume jewelry. Desperate for physical proof, I went down to the corporate basement the next morning to check the original workshop ledgers. A heavy brass plaque hung right next to the vault door, clearly stating that audio and video recording was in progress for security and insurance purposes. I swiped my employee badge, waited for the security light to flash red, and pulled the heavy steel handle. Nora Bell, the head archivist, stood perfectly still in the center of the room. The cold woman refused to let me pass the entryway, claiming several old ledgers had been moved off-site due to dampness. 2 hours later, I watched from my car as Nora hauled a heavy cardboard box into the parking garage and loaded it into her trunk. I went back to my desk and pulled up the modern laboratory report for the sterling blue. Deep inside the crystal structure, 3 specific natural inclusions formed a tiny constellation. It was a geological fingerprint. I opened the old 1968 insurance file for the Hart Blue on the shared network drive, comparing the historical notes to the modern scan. The 3 marks matched perfectly. Heavy footsteps stopped right behind my chair. Connor leaned down, kissed the top of my head, and gently pushed my laptop screen down until it clicked shut. He whispered that I was working too hard and suggested we drive up to the coast for the weekend. When we returned on Monday morning, the entire Hart file had completely vanished from the secure shared drive. Standing in my quiet hallway on the night of the gala, the memory tasted like ash. Connor was the only person who had seen the exact name and location of that file before it disappeared. The final piece of the puzzle had arrived in an unmarked envelope shortly after the file deletion. It contained a blurry photocopy of a handwritten ledger line. The faded ink read Hart Deposit, safekeeping only. On the back of the paper, someone had written a short instruction: ask Susan what her mother lost. That tiny piece of paper was the reason I had quietly submitted my professional objection to the auction house. I pulled the envelope out of my safe and stared at a tiny phone number stamped near the bottom corner. Taking a deep breath, I dialed the digits. The line rang 3 times before Nora Bell answered. The archivist sounded exhausted, her voice stripped of its usual corporate chill. She told me that if the stone was missing, William had officially started the last part of his father's plan. After hanging up the phone in my quiet hallway, I drove straight to the edge of the city. Nora Bell had chosen an all-night diner miles away from the Sterling building. The smell of stale coffee and industrial bleach hung heavy in the air. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from the head archivist, waiting for her to speak. She did not bother with a polite greeting. Instead, the older woman pushed a heavy canvas tote bag across the sticky table. Inside were 2 massive, leather-bound workshop ledgers. Nora kept her voice low, explaining that William had ordered a complete cleaning of the archive vault right before the centennial gala. Fearing the destruction of corporate history, she had packed the most dangerous volumes into her car, which explained why I had seen her carrying that heavy box. She had also mailed the anonymous envelope, needing to test if I actually cared about the truth, or if I just wanted to win a family argument. I opened the older volume, the brittle pages releasing a cloud of dry dust. The entry for 1968 sat near the bottom of the page. It clearly listed the Hart deposit, the safe number, and the original carat weight, followed by the exact phrase from my anonymous tip: safekeeping only. I carefully closed it and pulled out the second volume from 1991. A new entry showed a stone with the exact same raw material code being recut into the sterling blue. The slight reduction in carat weight perfectly matched standard diamond recutting loss. Between those two entries lay more than 20 years of absolute silence. Nora wrapped her hands around her ceramic mug and stared into the dark liquid. She admitted that she had not witnessed the original deposit in 1968. She had joined Sterling House in the late 80s. Not long after she started working there, Miriam returned to the office. She was older then, exhausted and desperate. Nora remembered her crying at the reception desk and begging the Sterling family to return something that belonged to her. The archivist leaned across the table and whispered one final detail. Susan still kept her mother's old sewing box, the place Miriam had once used to hide documents from her abusive husband. The next morning, I stood in the grand foyer of my mother-in-law's townhouse. William had already stationed a corporate lawyer in the living room, a man in a sharp suit who immediately started reciting confidentiality warnings. Susan walked in, looking exhausted, and pointed a trembling finger at the front door. She ordered the attorney to leave immediately. Once the heavy door clicked shut, I set the open workshop ledger on her glass coffee table. My mother-in-law stared at her father-in-law's handwriting. She slowly lowered herself onto the plush sofa, finally admitting that Miriam had handed over the diamond for protection. But William's wife clung to her last line of defense, suggesting her mother might have simply changed her mind and sold it later. I asked her to bring out the sewing box. Susan flinched. Her shoulders stiffened, and her eyes darted toward the hallway stairs. That visceral reaction told me everything I needed to know. After a long minute of heavy silence, she walked upstairs and returned carrying a worn wooden box. The scent of old cedar and cheap thread filled the room as she set it down. I pushed aside the loose spools and pressed my fingers against the bottom panel. It felt unusually thick. Pressing the corner hard, a thin, wooden slat popped loose, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a faded color photograph of the original necklace and a delicate sheet of carbon paper. It was the original safekeeping receipt, bearing the signatures of Miriam Hart, Harold Sterling Sr., and an independent witness. Susan pressed her hands over her mouth, swearing she had never opened that hidden layer. I watched a tear slide down her cheek, but I reserved my trust. "Where is the stone, Susan?" I asked softly. She looked at the floor and confessed what had happened before dinner. She had seen Connor leave the display area with a sealed transport case, then set it on a service cart while he took a phone call. Suspecting the real diamond was inside, Susan moved the case into the auction house's emergency insurer locker in the service corridor. That was her hand wearing the heavy family signet ring on the security footage. She had not opened the case or told Thomas what she had done. His alarm when the display case turned up empty had been genuine. After the gallery doors were locked, Susan gave him the locker receipt. Thomas and an insurance representative opened the tamper-sealed case under camera and confirmed that the sterling blue was safely inside. I looked back down at the delicate carbon receipt, feeling a sudden rush of victory, until my eyes caught a small note scribbled in the margin. The ink looked slightly different, and the script was sharp and aggressive. "Return to owner." Susan leaned over my shoulder, her breathing suddenly turning ragged. She pointed at those 3 words. The exact words the family could use to claim the diamond had been legally handed back. "That is William's handwriting," she whispered. Leaving my mother-in-law's townhouse with the carbon receipt tucked safely in my coat, I drove straight back to my temporary apartment. The 6 years I had spent building a life with Connor suddenly felt like a house of cards built on borrowed paper. A quiet knock interrupted my thoughts late that evening. Opening the heavy wooden door, I found my husband standing in the dimly lit hallway. Connor had come alone, carrying no lawyers and wearing no corporate armor. He stepped inside and began speaking in that soft, familiar cadence I used to find comforting. He reminded me of the rainy afternoon we first met 6 years ago during a Provenance review and our quiet wedding ceremony in the spring 2 years later. He told me he still loved me, claiming every deceit had been a desperate attempt to protect our future from the crushing debts his father had hidden for decades. Connor reached out, begging me to come back to the penthouse. He wanted us to write a joint statement, placing all the historical blame entirely on William, while signing a mutual agreement that would protect Connor's position as chief executive. I pulled out the original safekeeping receipt and showed him the margin note. The independent document examiner I had hired earlier that afternoon had already run preliminary chemical tests on the ink used for the words "return to owner." That specific formula did not even exist when Miriam handed over the diamond decades ago. The script imitated William's hand, but the chemical composition exposed a modern fabrication. Connor immediately shifted tactics, attempting to pin the forged marginal note on Susan, suggesting his mother might have doctored the paper to protect her own mother's legacy. When that argument failed, my husband pulled a heavy document from his leather portfolio, sliding a bill of sale across the coffee table. He claimed Miriam had executed the document shortly after the initial receipt, legally selling the stone to Harold Sterling Sr. The native file of this supposed bill of sale had already been uploaded by Connor into the secure auction data room as supplemental defense evidence after my initial objection. Thomas Keene had downloaded a secure preservation copy for our dispute file. Scanning the text, I noticed a glaring corporate anachronism. The document used a formal subsidiary title that Sterling House did not adopt until many years after Miriam's disappearance. Connor tried to brush it off as a modern transcription error made by a junior clerk. Instead of arguing, I opened my laptop. I placed the digital draft of the centennial contract beside the native bill of sale from the data room. Connor had emailed that draft 2 days before the gala and labeled it as a legal review. Even to the naked eye, the structural fingerprints matched completely. Both files shared a rare typographical error on a common corporate term, identical line breaks, and an unusually narrow left margin. Later forensic analysis by Thomas and an independent document expert confirmed that both files shared the exact same author identification tag and custom software template. I looked up from the screen, keeping my voice completely level. If the bill of sale was already legitimate, Connor, why did you need me to sign away my professional liability at the gala? The mask finally slipped. The gentle, reasonable husband vanished in an instant. Connor straightened his posture, his expression hardening into corporate coldness as he told me that if the auction failed, hundreds of innocent employees would lose their livelihoods and his mother would be dragged into public ruin. He accused me of caring more about abstract historical truth than about the people standing right in front of me. You did not ask me to save your family, I said, every word tasting like cold iron. You asked me to become the lie. Connor lunged forward, trying to grab the forensic comparison printouts from the coffee table. I pulled the papers out of his reach. It did not matter whether he destroyed the copies in front of me. I had already sent the original files and the forensic report to Thomas. His confirmation email was sitting safely in my inbox. My husband stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass on the kitchen counter. Seconds later, my phone pinged with a notification from the corporate server archives. Nora Bell had successfully recovered an automated backup file from the system database. It was a direct message Connor had sent to William weeks prior. Once Lauren signs, her objection becomes our confirmation. I opened the document properties of the raw bill of sale file on our secure management system, scrolling down to the very first saved version history. The original draft contained a single sentence that someone had frantically deleted. Temporary placeholder provenance. Replace after Lauren review. The creator ID attached to that deleted line was not William Sterling. It belonged to Connor Sterling, exactly 3 months before our 6th wedding anniversary. Standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the independent laboratory, I watched the technical team handle the Sterling blue. The stone remained locked inside a secure viewing capsule, guarded by representatives from both the insurance company and the auction house. I kept my distance, letting the instruments speak for themselves while William stood near the back of the room, sneering at my reliance on what he dismissed as tiny flaws. The specialist adjusted the high magnification lenses overhead, projecting the crystal interior onto a large monitor on the wall. A delicate feather fracture stretched across the lower pavilion, accompanied by 2 microscopic crystal inclusions arranged in a distinct triangular cluster. It was the exact geological fingerprint from the 1968 insurance appraisal of the Hart Blue, preserved across decades despite the modern recutting process. The lead gemologist tapped a keyboard, pulling up the historical workshop records Nora had saved. The weight discrepancy between the old ledger entry and the modern stone matched the exact loss percentages expected from reshaping an antique cushion cut into a contemporary brilliant. The physical chain of evidence had grown too solid for corporate lawyers to dismantle with empty words. Before I could draw a breath of relief, William launched his public counterstrike. Within 24 hours, financial news outlets published a coordinated wave of articles painting me as a bitter, estranged wife, attempting to steal family property out of spite. The chairman announced that I had breached corporate confidentiality, backed up by formal threats of multi-million-dollar civil lawsuits. A professional ethics committee at my certification board abruptly notified me that an anonymous grievance had triggered a formal inquiry into my conduct. My independent consulting career teetered on the brink of absolute destruction. Panic crawled up my throat. Sitting alone in my quiet kitchen, I dialed my mother's old landline number out of pure habit, wishing for a voice that understood the terror of losing everything for telling the truth. My father had lost his small jewelry shop decades ago after refusing to authenticate a fake stone for a wealthy client, and I suddenly felt the crushing weight of that exact same ancestral curse. Susan arrived unannounced 10 minutes later, letting herself in with a spare key. I refused her hollow apologies, staring past her designer coat. The older woman looked tired, admitting that William always won by making his opponents feel like the price of honesty was simply too high to keep paying. Desperate for any legal foothold to counter their defamation campaign, Nora searched through the historical corporate archives one last time. She uncovered the original police report filed by Harold Sterling Sr. after the alleged burglary back in 1969. The meticulous list of missing property included expensive pocket watches, heavy silver tableware, and several small gold rings, but the heart blue was completely absent from the inventory. If the diamond had truly been stolen from the corporate safe on that rainy night decades ago, the founder would have legally been forced to report it to local law enforcement. Omitting the most valuable gem in the collection proved he never believed it was stolen at all. He had kept it hidden on purpose. The public relations packet William had leaked to the press contained an ugly surprise. Buried deep within the digital distribution folder sat a signed legal affidavit from Connor. My husband swore under oath that I had confessed a deep resentment toward the family, claiming I openly intended to make the Sterlings pay for my father's professional failures. The devastating quote had been twisted out of a private late-night conversation we shared shortly after my father passed away. Connor had taken my grief, packaged it as a confession of malice, and handed it directly to his father's lawyers to destroy my name forever. The independent directors of Sterling House requested a private meeting in a quiet conference room downtown. They slid a thick confidentiality agreement across the table and outlined their settlement offer. William would take an immediate medical retirement. The diamond would be returned to Miriam's estate. The company would pay my legal expenses, withdraw the grievance filed against me, and provide the certification board with every document supporting my innocence. They could not order the professional inquiry closed. That decision belonged to the certification board alone. But they promised to stop fighting me and correct the false statements they had already submitted. Connor would remain chief executive to protect the company from collapse. In exchange, I had to sign a strict confidentiality agreement and publicly describe the fraud as a historical misunderstanding caused by the previous generation. Connor showed up at my apartment later that evening, begging me to accept their terms. He swore that if I destroyed the company, hundreds of innocent workers would lose their jobs overnight. He promised to cut all ties with his father and go to counseling together, looking at me with wide, desperate eyes. I asked him if he had pulled his signed affidavit from his father's legal files. Connor looked away, admitting he could not change it immediately. In that quiet hesitation, I saw the exact same man who had engineered the betrayal from the very beginning, still placing his corporate survival above the truth. Susan arrived shortly after my husband left, confessing the full extent of her own compromises. 12 years earlier, she had discovered her mother's letters and handed them directly to William. Her husband had convinced her that Miriam had already sold the stone and simply regretted it later. Wanting to believe the lie, she had agreed to let her mother's name be scrubbed from the exhibition history to protect Connor's inheritance. Before leaving, Susan handed me a small envelope she found tucked beneath the lining of the sewing box. It was a final, unsent letter from Miriam addressed directly to her daughter. The aging paper contained a heartbreaking warning, reminding Susan that no woman should ever trade her safety for corporate silence. I refused to sign the board settlement. Instead, working alongside Thomas Keene and one sympathetic director, I drafted an alternative restructuring plan. We proposed placing the corporate assets under judicial supervision, shielding the workers while freezing William and Connor out of power completely. Armed with our restructuring proposal, I called Thomas to initiate the formal filing. But before he could submit the paperwork, an emergency notification flashed across my laptop screen. Thousands of historical files from the Hart archive were being deleted live from the chairman's primary server account. I watched the audit log update in real time. The person executing the mass deletion was not sitting in William's downtown office. The remote IP address mapped directly to the private network connection inside the penthouse, where Connor was currently staying. Thomas Keene acted immediately upon my alert, triggering our legal preservation protocols before the live deletion could wipe our digital safety net. Our technical team did not need to hack or break security. The automated audit system of the corporate network legally preserved every single version of the files the moment the deletion command was executed. Security camera feeds from the penthouse lobby showed Connor sitting at his study desk, hammering away at his keyboard, while his father stood right behind him, barking out orders through the speakerphone of an open line. William had also attempted to cover his own tracks by sending frantic text messages to the head of security, demanding that all physical Hart folders be dumped into private family storage units and digital copies wiped clean. The security chief had wisely refused the order the moment he received our formal preservation notice, saving every single text as proof of ongoing obstruction. Faced with board suspension and impending criminal investigations, the two men immediately turned on each other. William shattered first, shouting during an emergency meeting that his son possessed total control over the digital systems and had manufactured the fake bill of sale entirely on his own initiative to push his father out of power. The older man spat out bitter accusations, calling Connor a weak, ambitious disappointment. Connor retaliated by forwarding an internal email he had received from William months earlier. The message explicitly instructed legal counsel to bury the safekeeping deposit history under a fabricated private acquisition narrative. William fought back by handing over Connor's signed affidavit and the malicious press packet messages. Father and son stood in front of the board, eagerly handing over evidence to destroy one another. Watching them tear each other apart from across the room, I realized the ultimate form of justice did not require me to raise my voice or throw a single punch. I simply needed to step back and let their shared cowardice finish the job. Susan arrived at the corporate offices just as the meeting dissolved into chaos, carrying a signed formal statement. She officially testified that she had handed her mother's letters directly to William 12 years ago, confirming that her husband had deliberately hidden the truth and later ordered the historical record rewritten. She also verified under oath that Connor had eavesdropped on that exact conversation from the hallway when he was a young man, proving my husband had known about the true ownership of the diamond long before we ever met. Investigators announced they were expanding their formal inquiry to include conspiracy, document fraud, and obstruction of justice against both father and son. But just as the prosecutors packed up their files to leave, William smirked and played a short audio clip over his phone speaker, claiming he possessed a secret recording proving I had willingly agreed to help the family fix the problematic provenance. The distorted audio echoed through the quiet conference room, cutting off mid-sentence with my own voice stating I could fix the provenance if given full access. William leaned back in his leather chair with a triumphant grin, claiming I had taken the assignment to doctor the historical records before turning around to blackmail the family. The Professional Ethics Committee immediately paused, preparing to suspend my credentials right then and there. Nora stepped forward before panic could take root, reminding Thomas about the strict security protocols governing the corporate archive vaults. She pointed out that every meeting held inside the secure rooms was automatically captured by permanent audio and video recording equipment under standard insurance policies. A prominent brass plaque right outside the heavy steel door explicitly warned everyone that audio and video recording was in progress for security and insurance purposes. Furthermore, the mandatory badge logs proved that William, Connor, and I had all swiped our employee cards directly beneath that warning sign before entering the room on the day of the conversation. Thomas acted swiftly, pulling the complete, unedited audio and video file from the forensic network backup that had been legally preserved under our preservation notice. The full recording played aloud for the board, restoring the missing context instantly. My voice rang out clear and steady through the speakers, finishing the sentence William had deliberately sliced apart. I can fix the provenance record by correcting it, not by inventing it. Give me full access, or remove my name. Immediately afterward, William's recorded voice answered in the audio file, demanding that I fix it because my name was the exact reason the auction house trusted the collection in the first place. The room fell into absolute silence. The unedited proof laid bare the fact that the two men had desperately needed my professional reputation to launder their fraudulent history, rather than catching me in any scheme of extortion. An emergency board hearing commenced later that afternoon, bringing together legal counsel, insurance representatives, and estate administrators. I presented our comprehensive chain of evidence in a direct, logical sequence. Miriam's original safekeeping deposit, the missing diamond from the police report, the workshop recut records, the microscopic inclusion match, William's hidden knowledge of the true ownership, Connor's forged bill of sale, the trap contract from the gala, and the live server deletion logs following the legal notice. No lengthy legal speeches were required. Each piece of physical and digital documentation spoke for itself. The board members voted unanimously to strip William and Connor of all executive titles and board seats. The corporate lenders immediately triggered their change of management clauses, approving our restructuring plan to protect the regular employees while keeping the family owners entirely locked out of operations. The museum administration formally announced that the Sterling family name would be scrubbed from the exhibition wing until a complete review of all corporate donations concluded. William turned his head toward me as security guards escorted him out of the building. His face twisted in rage as he hissed that I had single-handedly destroyed his family. I looked the fallen chairman in the eye and delivered the only truth that mattered. No. I stopped you from using my name to hold it together. Connor caught up with me in the private hallway outside the hearing room, looking pathetic as he begged for a lifeline. He promised to sign any document blaming his father entirely, offering me a share of whatever settlement money he could salvage. Without a word, I pulled out my phone and displayed the text messages and the signed affidavit he had weaponized against me. I reminded my husband that our marriage had not ended the night he lied to my face, but rather the exact moment he sat down at his computer and drafted a confession for me to sign. Later that evening, Thomas called me with one final update from the legal team. The independent estate administrator running Miriam Hart's historical files had uncovered a stunning new legal reality. Susan was not her mother's only surviving heir. Miriam had given birth to a second daughter decades ago, a child forced into adoption during the darkest days of her escape from domestic abuse. If that discovery held up under formal review, Susan possessed no legal authority to make unilateral decisions regarding the future of the diamond or its ceremonial return, meaning the reckoning facing the family reached far deeper than anyone had ever imagined. The independent estate administrator confirmed the existence of Margaret Hart Lewis, Miriam's second daughter who had been placed for adoption during those desperate years of running from an abusive marriage. Margaret did not appear as a greedy antagonist looking for a windfall payout. Instead, the quiet woman simply wanted her mother's true history recognized so that the family name would no longer belong to the Sterlings. Susan and Margaret reached a formal agreement, choosing to transfer the Sterling Blue into an independent public trust rather than allowing the asset to be sold off for private profit. The legendary diamond went on permanent display alongside the original safekeeping receipt, the antique sewing box, and the historical records documenting how female inheritance had been systematically scrubbed away by corporate power. A dedicated portion of the exhibition proceeds was earmarked to fund legal aid resources for women trapped in financially controlling relationships. William faced criminal prosecution, standing trial on multiple felony counts of attempted fraud and obstruction of justice, based on his modern digital sabotage rather than just his father's historical lies. A federal judge sentenced the fallen chairman to a significant term in federal prison, while his personal corporate shares were liquidated to satisfy court judgments, investigative fees, and restitution payouts. The final time I saw William was behind the heavy glass partition of a bleak prison visitor room, where he stared blankly at a television broadcast covering the grand opening of the Miriam Hart Blue exhibition. The news anchor carefully omitted the Sterling name from every headline, describing the family solely as unlawful holders of stolen property. The ultimate punishment for the man who had worshipped legacy was realizing he had lost all power to name anything. Connor received a shorter sentence, though federal prison time remained mandatory due to his direct involvement in document forgery, fraudulent auction entries, and active digital destruction during a legal preservation order. My former husband lost his executive position, his unvested equity, his professional reputation, and his marriage in one fell swoop. Refusing every offer of financial settlement or silence, I watched security officers lead him toward the cell blocks. Before the guards pulled him away, Connor looked back with hollow eyes and asked if I had ever truly loved him. The answer came without hesitation. I loved the man you pretended to be. The quiet rejection slammed the door on our history forever, offering no cruelty and leaving no room for doubt. Susan divorced William, stepped down from the foundation board, and relinquished all her personal trust privileges to the Independent Oversight Committee. Publicly acknowledging that she had known about the hidden claim for 12 years while choosing social standing over truth, she established a private support fund using her own personal assets. We met one final time before the museum opening. Susan begged for forgiveness, her voice breaking under the weight of her regret. I looked at the woman who had traded her mother's safety for corporate comfort. I believe you are sorry. That is not the same as being ready to trust you. The grand opening gala at the museum bore no resemblance to the suffocating corporate celebration from months prior. A clean brass plaque mounted beside the display case clearly identified Miriam Hart as the original rightful owner. The delicate carbon receipt and the vintage sewing box rested beneath protective glass, telling a complete story of endurance. Margaret and Susan stood together to pull the velvet drape away from the plaque. Susan wiped away silent tears, but no one attempted to make her grief the center of attention. I stood near the back of the exhibition hall, wearing no fancy jewels and holding no corporate title. My presence carried the quiet dignity of an independent expert who had simply forced the ledger to tell the truth. Later that week, I unlocked the glass door of my new professional office downtown, hanging a modest wooden sign that read Davis Integrity Research. Sitting at my desk, I picked up my father's old jeweler loupe, feeling the familiar weight of the brass frame against my fingers. A prospective client walked through the glass door a few minutes later, placing a sparkling diamond ring on the consultation desk. The nervous buyer asked if I could make the stone look significantly larger and cleaner on paper than it actually appeared under magnification. I set the loupe down on the polished wood, looking straight across the table. My work is not about making a stone look perfect. My job is making sure it tells the truth. They said I brought them nothing. So I left them with exactly that. No diamond, no legacy, no lie strong enough to hide behind. When the polished marble floors of the elite gala finally stopped echoing with the footsteps of those who traded their humanity for a corporate name, the real lesson remained stripped of all its glitter. You learn quickly that a life built on fabricated titles and hidden ledgers is nothing more than a house of cards waiting for the lightest draft of truth to bring it down. The people who spend decades guarding a lie eventually discover that their greatest enemy was never the person who questioned them, but the dishonesty they chose to protect. Power that relies on erasing others always collapses under the weight of its own deception, leaving behind a silence far heavier than any wealth could ever buy. Integrity is not something you inherit from a family crest or purchase with the sale of a disputed stone. It is forged in the quiet moments when you refuse to let your name become a shield for someone else's greed, and when you choose the hard burden of reality over the comfortable embrace of a well-crafted fiction. No legacy can ever survive when it is built on the suffering and silence of those who came before you, because truth has a way of rising through the cracks, no matter how deeply it is buried. You do not need to inherit a dynasty or control a corporate empire to leave a mark on the world. You only need the courage to make sure that what you leave behind is entirely real. Have you ever found yourself holding your tongue to protect a fragile peace, only to realize that the silence was costing you everything you truly valued?